The morning air over the training station is cold and still, the kind of quiet that exists only before engines start. Low cloud hangs across the horizon, unbroken and heavy, pressing down on the perimeter fields and the concrete dispersals. Dew clings to the grass along the taxiways. Visibility is adequate but muted, the light flattened by overcast skies that promise neither storm nor clarity, only persistence. On the apron, an Avro Lincoln sits motionless, its long wings stretching wide across the damp concrete. The aircraft is unmistakably a product of wartime thinking. Large, deliberate, built for endurance rather than elegance. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines are mounted in pays beneath the wings, each cowling dark against the gray morning. The bomber's tall vertical stabilizer rises above the fuselage like a fixed marker against the cloud base, a reminder of the aircraft's mass and authority. This is not a combat sortie. There are no targets plotted, no defensive armament crews rotating through gunnery positions. The flight scheduled for this morning is routine, a training exercise, logged on a chalkboard and discussed without urgency. Crews have flown versions of this profile many times before. Takeoff, climb, navigation, handling drills, possibly simulated emergencies, all within the boundaries of normal instruction. Ground crew move methodically around the aircraft. Fuel caps are secured. Control surfaces are checked and rechecked. The Lincoln size demands this kind of ritual. Nothing about the bomber is forgiving of assumption. It was designed to carry weight over distance, not to be nimble, not to recover easily from misjudgment at low altitude. Its margins exist, but they are narrow and they must be respected. Inside the fuselage, the aircraft smells of oil, cold metal, and canvas. The cockpit is functional rather than refined. Analog dials crowd the instrument panel, each needle resting where it should, waiting to be brought alive. The Lincoln's controls are heavy, especially on the ground, and require anticipation rather than reaction. This is an aircraft that rewards planning and punishes improvisation. The crew board in silence, each man familiar with his station. Training flights often carry an unspoken duality. They are both instructional and evaluative. Mistakes are expected, but only within limits. Authority gradients exist, sometimes subtly, sometimes sharply. An instructor may be present. A captain may be gaining experience. Roles are defined, but under pressure, definitions can blur. Outside, the weather remains unchanged. The cloud ceiling is low but legal. Wind is light. Nothing in the conditions demands cancellation. In post-war military aviation, there is an understanding that training must continue in imperfect environments. Skills are not built in ideal conditions. They are built in marginal ones. Engines begin to turn. One by one, the Merlins cough, then settle into a steady, restrained roll. The sound rolls across the airfield, echoing faintly off hangar walls and disappearing into the low cloud. Vibrations travel through the A-frame, through the concrete, through the boots of the ground crew as they step back and signal thumbs up. The Lincoln starts to taxi. Its nose wheel tracks deliberately along the center line, the pilot making small corrections to keep the aircraft aligned. At this speed, control is limited. Momentum matters. Everything about the bomber at ground level hints at what will come later in the air. Slow response, significant inertia, and an absolute requirement for anticipation. In the cockpit, checklists are followed without haste. Fuel selectors, magnetos, engine temperatures, control checks. Each item is spoken aloud, acknowledged, confirmed. Training flights are meant to reinforce discipline as much as skill. Procedure is a framework that keeps error contained. There is no sense of impending disaster. The aircraft is serviceable. The crew is qualified. The flight plan is ordinary. If tension exists, it is a quiet tension inherent in any operation involving weight, altitude, and mechanical complexity. Aviation does not require drama to be dangerous. It requires only small misalignments, introduced gradually and left uncorrected. As the Lincoln lines up on the runway, the airfield ahead disappears into a uniform gray. The horizon is indistinct. Visual references will be limited after takeoff. Instrument flying will matter. So will trust in the aircraft, in the procedures, and in each other. Power is advanced. The Merlins respond together, their combined thrust pushing the bomber forward. Acceleration is steady rather than forceful. The Lincoln gathers speed slowly, deliberately, as if weighing the decision to leave the ground. Control inputs increase. The aircraft grows lighter on its wheels. At rotation speed, the nose lifts. The runway drops away. The bomber climbs into the overcast, its shape briefly silhouetted against the low cloud before disappearing entirely. From the ground, the sound of the engines fades, swallowed by distance and weather. Another training flight has departed. There is nothing to mark it as unusual. No witness could say, at this moment, that the sequence of events has already begun. The airfield returns to its routine. Paperwork continues. Other aircraft prepare for later sorties. The morning remains cold and overcast, unchanged by the Lincoln's departure. What follows will not be defined by a single decision or sudden failure. It will unfold through timing, environment, procedure, and the thin margins that separate control flight from irreversible loss. By 1950, the world's air forces were living in the shadow of a war that had ended less than 5 years earlier. The urgency of combat had passed, but its machinery remained. Aircraft designed for survival over hostile territory were now being flown in peacetime skies, tasked with a new mission, training the next generation of crews. The risks had changed, but they had not disappeared. The Avro Lincoln belonged squarely to this transitional moment. Conceived in the final years of the Second World War, it was an evolution rather than a revolution. The design extended the lineage of the Avro Lancaster, longer wings, greater range, higher operating ceilings. It was built to carry heavy loads farther and higher, responding to lessons learned late in the bombing campaign over Europe. By the time it entered service in meaningful numbers, the war it was meant to fight was over. Instead, the Lincoln became a mainstay of post-war bomber squadrons and training units. For air forces across the Commonwealth, it filled a gap between wartime piston-engine bombers and the jet aircraft that was still in development. It was large, complex, and demanding, exactly the kind of aircraft thought suitable for producing disciplined, technically competent crews. Training doctrine in the late 1940s reflected wartime experience. Crews were expected to be versatile, resilient, and capable of operating under pressure. This philosophy shaped the way training flights were conducted. Exercises often included simulated failures, abnormal procedures, and operations in marginal weather. The assumption was that exposure built competence. The boundary between realism and risk, however, was not always clearly defined. Military aviation in this period accepted accident rates that will be considered intolerable today. The logic was partly institutional and partly cultural. Aircraft were robust but unforgiving. Safety systems were limited. Instrumentation was improving but still prone to ambiguity. Above all, there was a belief that disciplined crews could manage most situations through adherence to procedure and experience. The Avro Lincoln demanded exactly that. Weighing significantly more than its Lancaster predecessor, it exhibited different handling characteristics, particularly during takeoff, climb, and low-speed flight. Control forces were heavy. Engine outperformance, while adequate at altitude, left little margin during training profiles conducted closer to the ground. Any deviation from prescribed speeds or configurations had consequences that developed slowly, but were difficult to reverse. Training flights were structured to expose crews to these realities. Pilots practiced asymmetric flight, simulated engine failures, and instrument departures. Navigators refined dead reckoning and radio aids. Flight engineers managed fuel, power settings, and engine health. Each role was interdependent. A lapse in one area could propagate through the entire crew. Authority gradients were a defining feature of this environment. Instructors carried responsibility not only for the aircraft, but for the development of less experienced pilots. Trainees, in turn, were expected to demonstrate confidence without overstepping their limits. Communication mattered. So did clarity of command. Ambiguity in who was flying the aircraft or who was making decisions could erode situational awareness, especially during abnormal exercises. The regulatory framework of the time reflected these assumptions. Accident investigation existed, but its focus was often corrective rather than preventative. Findings aimed to identify errors and reinforce discipline. Systemic human factors analysis, as understood today, was still decades away. The language of investigations emphasized errors of judgment rather than latent conditions. Weather added another layer of complexity. Post-war training did not pause for overcast skies or reduced visibility unless conditions fell below strict minima. Crews were expected to operate in cloud, relying on instruments that required careful interpretation. Spatial disorientation, particularly during climb and turn, was a recognized hazard, but one that was believed to be manageable through training. The airspace itself was less structured than it would become in later decades. Radar coverage was limited. Air traffic control procedures were still evolving. Much of the responsibility for separation, navigation, and terrain clearance rested with the crew. In training environments, this responsibility was sometimes deliberately stressed. Against this backdrop, the training flight involving the Avro Lincoln was neither exceptional nor experimental. It was part of a routine cycle designed to maintain readiness and proficiency. The aircraft had flown similar profiles before. The crew had practiced comparable exercises. Nothing in the scheduling or authorization of the flight suggested elevated risk. Yet the convergence of post-war assumptions, demanding aircraft characteristics, and instructional pressure created conditions where small misjudgments could accumulate unnoticed. The Lincoln was capable, but it required precision. Training doctrine assumed that precision would be maintained. What this accident would reveal, in retrospect, is how easily normal operation can drift toward the edge of safe margins, especially when experience, confidence, and routine begin to substitute for deliberate caution. The context is not one of recklessness, but of transition. An air force adapting from war to peace. An aircraft built for one purpose, repurposed for another. A training system confident in its methods, but only beginning to understand their limits. The Avro Lincoln was not an aircraft that tolerated simplification. Every aspect of its operation demanded coordination between systems, between crew members, and between planning and execution. To understand how a routine training flight could deteriorate into an unrecoverable situation, each of these angles must be examined not in isolation, but as part of a connected system. The aircraft, at its core, the Lincoln was a heavy bomber designed around endurance and payload. Its extended wings provided improved high-altitude performance, but they also altered handling characteristics at lower speeds. Control inputs required deliberate force. Roll response lagged behind pilot command, particularly when the aircraft was not perfectly balanced. This was manageable in cruise. It was less forgiving during climb or maneuvering close to the ground. Power came from 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, reliable by the standards of the time, but mechanically complex. Each engine demanded careful management. Power settings had to be matched precisely to avoid yaw. Propeller pitch, mixture control, and cooling all required continuous attention. In training scenarios, where simulated failures were introduced, the workload increased sharply. Engine outperformance was a known limitation. With one engine producing reduced or simulated zero power, the Lincoln could maintain flight, but only within specific speed and configuration envelopes. Any reduction below minimum control speed increased the risk of asymmetric loss of control. Recovery depended on immediate, correct inputs and sufficient altitude. The aircraft's instrumentation reflected its era. Attitude, airspeed, and rate of climb indicators were reliable but basic. There were no automated warnings, no flight directives, no envelope protection. Instrument interpretation relied on training and experience. In cloud, small deviation could go unnoticed until it became significant. The crew, bomber crews operated as a unit, but authority was not always evenly distributed. The captain bore ultimate responsibility, yet training flights often placed less experienced pilots in the left seat under supervision. Instructors intervened as needed, but the timing and clarity of that intervention mattered. Experience gaps could create hesitation. A trainee might delay corrective action, waiting for confirmation. An instructor might allow a situation to develop longer than ideal, using it as a teaching moment. In a forgiving aircraft, this carried little risk. In the Lincoln, margins were narrower. Communication protocols existed, but their effectiveness depended on assertiveness and shared understanding. Clear verbalization of airspeed, altitude, and power changes was essential, particularly during abnormal exercises. Any ambiguity could degrade situational awareness across the crew. Fatigue, while rarely highlighted in official reports of the era, was an underlying factor. Training schedules were demanding. Repetition bred familiarity, but also complacency. The mental load of monitoring multiple systems in a large crew environment could erode attention to subtle changes. The environment, whether on the day of the flight, was not extreme, but it was limiting. Overcast conditions reduced visual references shortly after takeoff. Once inside cloud, the crew relied entirely on instruments to maintain attitude and climb profile. Spatial disorientation was a known risk during this phase of flight, particularly if combined with power asymmetry. Terrain around training bases was often uneven, chosen for operational realism rather than safety margin. Rising ground or nearby obstacles required strict adherence to climb procedures. Any deviation in track or altitude could reduce clearance rapidly. Visibility beneath the cloud layer was muted. From the cockpit, the transition from ground reference to instrument flight was abrupt. This transition period, just after liftoff, was historically one of the most hazardous phases of flight. The systems interaction. What made the situation complex was not a single failing component, but the interaction between systems and decisions. Power management affected you. You affected airspeed. Airspeed affected control authority. Control authority determined whether the aircraft could be kept within safe limits. Training exercises often stacked these challenges deliberately. A simulated engine failure shortly after takeoff tested crew coordination and procedural discipline. Done correctly, it reinforced critical skills. Done slightly outside prescribed parameters, it left little room for correction. Procedures were written with assumptions, prompt recognition, immediate response, and adequate altitude. If any one of these assumptions failed, the entire safety net weakened. The Lincoln's design did not hide mistakes. It revealed them slowly, then decisively. An aircraft drifting below target airspeed might remain controllable for several seconds, giving the illusion of stability. But once critical thresholds were crossed, recovery demanded altitude and time, resources that training profiles did not always provide. Each of these angles, aircraft design, crew dynamics, environment, and systems, was individually manageable. Together, under training conditions, they formed a chain. Not a dramatic one, not an obvious one, but a chain that could tighten quietly until no further options remained. The sequence that followed the Lincoln's departure from the runway did not unfold suddenly. There was no single sound, no abrupt motion that signaled failure. Instead, the aircraft entered a phase where timing, configuration, and perception began to diverge, quietly, incrementally. After liftoff, the bomber climbed into the overcast. Visual references faded almost immediately, replaced by instrument indications and engine sound. This transition was expected. Crews trained for it. The aircraft's attitude was established by reference to the artificial horizon, its climb rate monitored against procedure. At this stage, the Lincoln was operating close to its most vulnerable envelope, heavy with fuel and crew, still accelerating, and with limited altitude beneath it. The aircraft required disciplined power management and precise airspeed control. Any deviation needed immediate correction. During the climb, a training exercise was introduced. The nature of the exercise, consistent with doctrine of the period, involved abnormal operation. Power on one engine was reduced, either to simulate failure or to practice asymmetric handling. The procedure was familiar, but the timing was critical. With asymmetric thrust applied, the aircraft demanded increased rudder input to maintain directional control. Drag increased. Climb performance degraded. Airspeed margins narrowed. All of this was predictable and documented. What mattered was recognition and response. Instrument indications began to diverge subtly from the expected profile. The rate of climb decreased. Airspeed stabilized below the ideal target, but not yet in a range that felt immediately unsafe. The aircraft remained controllable. The sensation of stability persisted. Inside the cockpit, workload increased. Power settings were monitored. Control pressures rose. Communication became more clipped, more functional. The Lincoln continued climbing, but more slowly now, its margin eroding with each second spent below optimum speed. Cloud obscured any external reference. There was no visual cue to signal attitude change or drift. The crew's understanding of the aircraft state depended entirely on instruments and procedural memory. Small deviations required active detection. As the exercise continued, the bomber's energy state degraded further. With asymmetric thrust and increasing drag, the aircraft approached minimum control speed. At this point, the Lincoln's design characteristics became decisive. Control response lagged. Rudder authority diminished. Any attempt to correct your demanded airspeed that was no longer available. Recognition came late. Not catastrophically late, but late enough that options narrowed rapidly. Corrective action was initiated. Power was adjusted. Control inputs increased. But altitude, the one resource that could absorb delay, was insufficient. The aircraft began to roll toward the side of reduced power. This was not abrupt. It was a gradual, increasing bank that demanded immediate counteraction. As the bank angle increased, lift decreased. The descent rate began to build. In cloud, without visual reference, spatial orientation became fragile. Instrument indications now required rapid interpretation under stress. The Lincoln's heavy controls resisted sudden correction. Recovery procedures assumed a margin that no longer existed. The bomber descended out of controlled flight. The sequence was measured in seconds, not moments, but those seconds were decisive. There was no opportunity for stabilization, no altitude for recovery. The aircraft struck terrain at speed. The impact was unsurvivable. There was no prolonged distress call, no time for improvisation. The chain that had formed through design limits, training practice, and timing had closed completely. From the outside, the event was abrupt. From inside the cockpit, it was the final stage of a process already underway, one that had progressed beyond correction before its seriousness was fully apparent. The flight ended not because of recklessness, but because margins were consumed faster than they were recognized. The loss of the Avro Lincoln did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived as absence. When the aircraft failed to return, the first response was procedural. Timetables were checked. Radio logs were reviewed. Training flights occasionally ran long, particularly when exercises were extended or whether complicated recovery. But as minutes passed without contact, concern hardened into certainty. Search procedures were initiated, shaped by the limitations of the era and the assumption that time mattered. Wreckage was located in difficult terrain beneath low cloud. The aircraft had not scattered across a wide area. There was no indication of in-flight breakup. The impact profile suggested controlled flight had been lost only moments before ground contact. The evidence pointed not to explosion or structural failure, but to a sudden and unrecoverable descent. Recovery operations were constrained by weather and access. Investigators worked deliberately, documenting what could be documented, aware that interpretation would rely heavily on procedure, probability, and reconstruction rather than recorded data. There were no flight data recorders, no cockpit voice recordings. What remained were instruments, engine components, and the written record of the flight's intent. The investigation followed the standards of the time. Its mandate was to determine cause, not to assign blame publicly. The aircraft was examined for mechanical failure. Engines were assessed for evidence of malfunction. Control systems were checked for continuity. Nothing suggested a catastrophic technical defect. Attention turned to operational factors. Investigators reconstructed the likely training profile based on squadron practice and witness accounts of engine sound shortly after takeoff. The possibility of a simulated engine failure during climb was considered not as an anomaly, but as a normal part of instruction. The question was not why such an exercise was attempted, but whether it was conducted within safe margins. Findings pointed toward loss of control during asymmetric flight at low altitude, compounded by limited visibility and insufficient airspeed. The aircraft's handling characteristics were well known. Procedures existed to manage them. The conclusion was that the sequence developed faster than it could be arrested. Language in the report reflected its time. Phrases emphasized judgment, handling, and control. There was little discussion of workload saturation, authority gradient, or training design. These concepts, while implicitly present, were not yet formalized within accident analysis. The impact of the accident was nonetheless real. Training practices involving simulated failures during the most vulnerable phases of flight came under review. Emphasis was placed on altitude and airspeed margins. Instructors were reminded of the importance of immediate intervention when exercises approached procedural limits. The Avro Lincoln itself was not withdrawn from service as a result of the accident. It continued to fly in training and operational roles. But the event added to a growing body of evidence that heavy, piston-engine bombers left little room for error during low-level abnormal operations. For the unit involved, the loss was personal as well as institutional. Training schedules paused. Crews absorbed the lesson in the most direct way possible. Silence replaced routine. The investigation closed without controversy. There were no sensational conclusions, no dramatic reforms announced publicly. Instead, the accident joined a quiet archive of post-war losses that collectively reshaped how training risk was understood, even if that understanding evolved slowly. The Avro Lincoln accident did not become a headline. It did not redefine aviation overnight. Its influence was quieter, absorbed into the gradual evolution of training philosophy and operational caution that followed the war. That silence does not diminish its significance. It clarifies it. In the years after 1950, military aviation began to confront a difficult truth. Peacetime training could be as hazardous as combat, particularly when wartime practices were carried forward without adjustment. Heavy aircraft, designed for high-altitude stability and long-range endurance, were unforgiving during low-level, high workload scenarios. The Lincoln was not unique in this respect. It was representative. Procedures changed incrementally. Simulated engine failures during the most critical phases of flight were increasingly restricted or moved to safer altitudes. Emphasis shifted toward energy management and margin preservation. Instructors were encouraged to intervene earlier, prioritizing safety over demonstration. More importantly, a cultural shift began to take shape. Accident analysis slowly expanded beyond individual judgment toward systemic understanding. Training design, workload, and human limitations gained recognition as contributing factors rather than afterthoughts. This evolution was uneven and incomplete, but it marked a departure from earlier assumptions. The Avro Lincoln continued its service life into the mid-1950s, eventually giving way to newer aircraft and, ultimately, to jet bombers that introduced their own challenges. Yet the lessons learned from its operations informed broader doctrine. Heavy aircraft demanded respect for their inertia and their limits. Training required structure as much as realism. For the crew lost on the training flight, the legacy is not one of error, but of contribution. Their loss became part of the foundation on which safer procedures were built. This is the unspoken contract of aviation progress. That knowledge is often purchased at high cost, and that responsibility lies in honoring that cost through improvement. Today, accident prevention rests on layers that did not exist in 1950: flight data monitoring, standardized crew resource management, refined simulator training. These advances did not emerge spontaneously. They were shaped by events like this one, accumulated quietly over decades. The Avro Lincoln crash stands as a reminder that routine is not synonymous with safety, and that training environments demand the same respect as operational ones. The aircraft performed as designed. The systems responded as expected. What failed was not a machine, but the margin between expectation and reality. In the end, the story does not close with impact, but with continuity. Procedures rewritten, habits reconsidered, assumptions challenged. On the airfields where Lincolns once departed into overcast skies, the sound of Merlin engines has long since faded. What remains is an understanding, earned, not given, that aviation safety advances not through drama, but through reflection, restraint, and memory.